Good morning and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Today we come to the fourth generation of this important family in the book of Genesis. And I have to say up front that the more I have learned about Joseph, the more important I think his story is. And in fact, I found a lot of New Testament theology about forgiveness and grace in this Old Testament story. Again, Joseph's story is somewhat familiar to us. Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, but it was clear to everyone that he was Jacob's favorite. You probably have a vague memory that Jacob gave Joseph a coat of many colors, but I need to tell you that in recent years, most biblical scholars believe that was a mistranslation and that it probably was a coat with long sleeves, a rarity in those days. His brothers didn't like him because he was the favorite and also because of his dreams. He told his brothers about his dreams in which they all bowed down to him. Well, they knew that they would never bow down to this younger, irksome brother. One day they'd had enough, and when Jacob sent Joseph out into the fields to check on his brothers, they ended up selling Joseph to some traders heading for Egypt, and then telling Jacob that they had found Joseph's blood-smeared long-sleeved coat along their way home. Jacob presumed Joseph had been killed by a wild animal and grieved the loss of his son. Joseph had all sorts of adventures in Egypt. At first, he was a slave to a man named Potiphar, but ended up in jail on a trumped-up charge after he rebuffed the advances of Mrs. Potiphar. Then, two of his prison mates had dreams which Joseph was able to interpret. Eventually, the Pharaoh had a dream of 7 thin cows eating 7 fat cows and not getting any fatter. Joseph was brought from the prison to interpret it, and he said that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, and that the wise Pharaoh would store up during the years of plenty to have enough to get through the years of famine. The Pharaoh thought that this was a good plan, and what's more, who would be better to put that plan in place than someone as wise as Joseph? So just like that, Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in Egypt. And he goes about storing up food and grain so that there will be enough for the people in the famine. When the famine does hit, eventually Joseph's brothers learn that there is grain in Egypt, and so they go down to buy some and bow down before Joseph, although they don't know who he is. That might confuse us, but consider that it had been many years in between. Joseph had probably adopted Egyptian styles and clothing, and most of all, they weren't looking for him in that kind of position, so they didn't see him there. But Joseph remembered them. And eventually Joseph revealed himself to them. Let me share with you some parts of Genesis 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." And you have to notice Joseph's profound compassion and love for his family, even though they had sought to kill him and get rid of him. And that might make you think of Jesus and his compassion and love for us, and how it was for our sins he died, and how often we reject Jesus. Even more, Joseph saw God's hand in what had happened to him, that God had sent him to be able to preserve life and a future for this family. They go back and get Jacob, who rejoices that his son he thought was dead is now alive. And they all go down and settle in Egypt. And in case you missed it, we have a story moving from death to life, in some ways foreshadowing what happens with Jesus. Finally, in the end, Jacob has died, and Joseph's brothers start to worry that Joseph will finally have his revenge on them. In Genesis 50, we read, realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? So they approached Joseph, saying, your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, we are here as your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. First, I think it's important that as powerful as he was in the land of Egypt, Joseph kept things in perspective. He knew who he was, and he knew who God was. And sometimes we forget that and get caught up in our own self-importance. But by far the most important part was that last part. What you intended as harm, God intended for good. What a powerful message of grace. God takes the wrong of our world and brings about something new, something good. It doesn't get more New Testament than that. God's grace is amazing indeed. So there you have 4 generations of one family in Genesis. But the truth is, it's really the story of one family, the story of God's family. It's the story of God's promise carried through to them and through and to us. It's the story of God seeking and saving God's people. Most of all, it's a story of grace. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.